Okay, there are some legal issues in selection, and we could talk all day about this. We don't have time, but as you know, there are certain protected classes, and there are federal laws, there's state laws, and many times there's local laws as well. Not always with smaller communities, but race, color, creed, national origin, all of those kinds of things. So we need to be careful, obviously, about that. I want to dig into that in a little bit different way. And it has to do with stereotypes. So I found this list of male and female stereotypes on the internet. I'm not suggesting, not even for a second, that these stereotypes are true. There are some men who might be assertive and analytical, but certainly not all men. There are some women who might be intuitive or passive, but certainly not all. But here's the problem. That in the interviewing process, because that it is inherently subjective, it's easy for us to fall prey to these stereotypes. And it's this concept of subconscious bias. We all have it. And sometimes we're not very aware of it. That's why they call it subconscious. But we all have these different ideas of different kinds of people. So whether someone is tall or short or slender or large, or the color of their skin, the color of their hair, whether they have tattoos, there's all kinds of things. And in fact, it is said that when a candidate walks in the door, that the interviewer makes an assessment of them in like a couple of seconds, even before they have time to shake their hand. And it's one thing to keep our eyes open and to be aware of what's going on, but we need to be very careful about our preconceived notions, these subconscious stereotypes, and to make decisions based on that. We all have those things embedded in us. It doesn't mean that we need to act on them. And that is the problem with interviewing, as I said before, because it is so subjective. It's easy for these stereotypes and biases to come into play. So it's just something we need to be aware of. So another handout that I have is associated with acceptable and unacceptable inquiries, primarily related to protected classes, for the most part based on federal laws. Many of the federal and state laws kind of mirror one another, but that's something that you might want to take a look at. I would also suggest that you check with your state government about what those laws might be, and if you maybe have a local human rights commission, that sort of thing. So tied to this then, because interviewing is such a subjective thing, we have the potential for rating errors. And quite frankly, we all have rating errors when we do this. And as I indicated before, most of us think we're pretty good judges of character, but the reality is doesn't always work out that way. So this is what I am very guilty of. Similar to me or different from me. We all have our own experiences. And so it is common to use ourselves as a yardstick for determining whether somebody else is going to be a great candidate or not. So that's that similar to me, different from me kind of a thing. So we need to take a little bit bigger perspective. And then one of the advantages of having good job descriptions with behavioral competencies or standards is that we're less likely to veer off on some of these more subjective kinds of things. So that would be another one, is to have varying standards. And that happens particularly when we have not delineated the standards that we're really looking for when we hire people. So determine in advance what those standards might be. Bias and prejudice, which we were just talking about. And again, it is always there for all of us. That is the reality of it. But we just need to make sure that those biases do not come into play with the actual decision. The halo and horn effect, and the idea there is that there are certain characteristics that you give disproportional credence to. So there could be a positive thing. If somebody has a certain characteristic that you really like, then you ignore all the other things that might be a problem, or the other way around. I'll give you a quick example. Years ago, I worked for an organization, and my job primarily was the interviewing and selection, and I'd take candidates to this one particular department, and this department manager had this idea that the only good employee for his department would be women, females, and they had to be over the age of 50, which is kind of a opposite kind of discrimination than what we usually see. But he only believed that women over 50 could work for him. And you could take him other people who were highly qualified, had the right characteristics, experience, training, all those things. And if they didn't fit that mold of his, he would find a reason to disqualify them. Well, there's legal issues with that, but there's also some practical issues as well. Okay, so what do you do about these biases and prejudice kinds of things? First of all, to create structured interviews. What I mean by that is that you treat all of your candidates in a pretty much an equivalent kind of way, that we're going to have some predetermined questions that we ask everybody, that we use behaviorally based questions. We're going to get into that real soon, but we standardize that process. So everybody is treated as similar as we can. And there's some good reasons for that too. One reason would be, say for example, a candidate is not selected and they belong to a protected class. Maybe they have a disability, for example, and they come back and they say, you didn't give me the job, and I think the reason you didn't is because I have a disability. Well, if you have a structured interview and you treat them all equivalently, you ask the similar questions, pretty much the same questions, then you have a better position to say, well, no, these are the reasons we did it. Unfortunately, you didn't emerge as the best candidate, and here's why, because we treated everybody the same. The other thing is time and information. It is interesting, you can have a bias with somebody, but the more time you spend with them, the more you tend to appreciate who they really are. And all of a sudden, those biases and prejudices kind of melt away and they become less and less significant. So spending time with people, maybe having multiple interviews, that can make a difference. Multiple participants, and what I mean by that is that maybe you have 2 or 3 people on your interviewing team. This is one of those situations where 2 heads are probably better than 1. And I'm a real fan of this idea that you have a couple people doing the interviewing while one person asks the question, the other person can do a better job of paying attention, maybe making some notes. And then you can also kind of bounce things off one another. After the interview, you and I can talk, and maybe you perceive some things that I didn't, and vice versa. And then the other thing, you're being here, just this idea of awareness and education and this realization that there is a subjectivity to selection and that we need to be aware of it and not let those things get in the way of making good decisions.